Last lecture for the week. Hooray. Cheers to you for making it this far. We'll bring it all full circle now, and I think this lecture might be most useful for you as you answer the weekly response, where I ask you kind of this exact question. How was the world of 1914 and 1945? How were those worlds so radically different? I mean, if we were able to have a time travel device and we went to 1914, I think most of us looking around and reading the newspaper and talking to people would say, this is a totally different world. If we went before the beginning of the First World War, so we went to June 1914, or even before that, we went to May 1914, and we talked to people and we took it all in, we'd be like, wow, I can't believe this is the world. There were still empires, there were still emperors and a czar in Russia, and the Industrial Revolution hit anywhere. People had never heard of, atomic weapons or anything. But we go fast forward to 1945 and we talk to someone right at the end of the Second World War, or maybe in 1950, about 5 years after the Second World War, we'd be like, yeah, I get a lot of this, There's tension. The global superpower is the United States, but in 1914, no one would have said that. The global superpowers in 1914 were Germany, France, Great Britain, Russia. You fast forward to 1950, and the global superpower is the United States. And the up-and-coming superpower is the Soviet Union. And that's how the entire world is organized, around those two powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And so we've got to ask ourselves, how did that become, right? How does 1945 and why does 1945 look so different from 1914? So last lecture we talked a lot about the interwar period. We talked about how the Treaty of Versailles from 1918 really created Hitler and created Nazi Germany because of the brutal punishments that were placed on the German economy, and that affected the German people, which allows them to really buy into the idea of Nazism, in its idea of the Fuhrer, and its idea of military superiority, and in its ideas of anti-Semitism. And this is what your primary source discussion asked you to kind of talk a little bit about. Why did the German people buy into the idea of anti-Semitism? So, we looked a little bit about how the interwar period, and really 1918, the Treaty of Versailles, created Hitler, and how Second World War, therefore, is really just an extension of the First World War. And a thing that's really important to understand this fourth lecture is that the powers that fought against Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s were not fighting against Nazi Germany because of the Holocaust. In fact, it's really important to note that most people around the world, and even a lot of people within Germany, and I'm not trying to remove any blame here. The Holocaust is arguably one of the worst genocidal moments in world history, right? Along with the transatlantic African slave trade, along with other acts of genocide that have been committed before and since the Holocaust stands out just because of the mass scale of death and destruction and how calculated, like the African slave trade, this moment was. But a lot of people in Germany didn't know exactly what was going on. They were certainly anti-Semitic, and they certainly kind of saw the Jews, especially German Jews, as a danger to the Nazi Party, but they didn't know the full extent of the Holocaust. They didn't quite understand the systematic destruction of Jewish and other non-preferred Aryan people within Germany. And this is really important to note. The United States, Great Britain, France, eventually the Russians, none of them go to war with Germany to end the Holocaust. That's not the argument that's made. The destruction that the Japanese brought in China, for example, maybe some of you have heard of the Rape of Nanking. I don't have any images of that included in these PowerPoints because they can be very triggering. So, I don't want to necessarily include any of that. But the Japanese committed horrible war atrocities in Southeast Asia, especially in China. And the United States knows well what's going on in China, but they don't go to war. So there's not a humanitarian war against the Empire of Japan. None of kind of the battles in the Second World War as it was fought were for humanitarian reasons. In Europe, the war was basically over the power of Germany. Did Germany have the right to invade and annex Poland? Did they have the right to invade and annex France? And obviously not, right? The British said this is a total violation of Versailles, and that's why they went to war. Same with the French, and eventually the Soviet Union, who got betrayed and invaded by Hitler, says the same thing. This is German aggression. That's what the war was about. In the Pacific, it's about the exact same thing. The United States was wary of the Japanese, especially as Japan was expanding its empire. We talked a little bit last week, remember, about Japanese expansion into Manchuria, that part of northern China, where they defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. Well, the US eyed Japanese expansion and said, well, at least it's on the other side of the Pacific. We don't have much to worry about. But as the Japanese continued to expand into China, into all of Southeast Asia, right, what becomes Vietnam, at that time Indochina, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies, and then the Philippines, when the Japanese seize all of these regions, the Philippines from the United States, by the way, the United States begins to worry about it. And it's ultimately, a battle in 1941, a sneak attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. The idea that the Japanese recognized that the United States was going to enter this war, and they were going to enter the war against Japan, and so they had to strike first. And then in 1941, they have the sneak attack, right, on Pearl Harbor, where they try to disable the American Navy before the United States has the chance to fight back against the Japanese. And you notice something if you look at this map. Pearl Harbor is December 1941. The Battle of Midway, which is the next major battle in the Pacific, isn't fought until June of 1942. And then most of the other very large battles aren't fought until late 1942 and late 1943 and then into 44, 45. The battle in Europe came first. Winston Churchill was able to convince the Americans that really the battle in Europe had to be won before they could turn their attention to Asia. But again, the war against the Japanese had nothing to do with humanitarian concerns. It was really a political and an expansionist war that was fought against Japan there. But nonetheless, at the end of World War II, the war ends in Europe because ultimately the Soviet Union is able to fight off the Germans in what is now Russia. They're able to fight off the Germans in Russia, and they get to Berlin first. About 5 days before the Allies, after invading Normandy and pushing back into Germany, the Soviets actually get to Berlin first and cause the Germans to really surrender. It's the Soviets and then the Allies in that field. And then, of course, the use of atomic weapons. Rather than invade Japan, President Truman orders the dropping of new weapons of war, the atomic weapons, on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, forcing the Japanese into unconditional surrender and avoiding what would have been an absolutely devastating invasion of Japan. The world in 1945, then, when this war ends, looks so much different than 1914 and 1918. Right, 1918, the war had ended because the power had shifted. Americans had joined the war. The Germans were on the outs. They surrender and they're forced to pay reparations, but there's not this kind of like big moments. But the end of the Second World War in 1945 is just absolutely catastrophic. First of all, as the Russians and as the Allies are liberating parts of Germany from Nazi control, they're coming across the concentration camps. And news of these concentration camps that were largely hidden from the rest of the world becomes public. So for the first time, the world understands what the final solution was. Hitler's final solution, the extermination of non-Aryan people. The world comes to see genocide on a massive scale for really the first time. And this has a really dramatic effect on how people view fascism, how they view dictatorship, how they view othering, right? People begin to worry, how have we let this happen? How has such systematic and prejudiced, not just oppression, but death, destruction, and genocide been allowed to happen? At the end of the Second World War, there's roughly 20 million military personnel that are killed. You can see a graph here of, who really lost the most. It's the Soviet Union, once again. Same with the First World War. The Russians had lost the most. Well, in the Second World War, the Soviet Union had lost both the most military personnel and civilians due to the Second World War, followed by Germany. You'll notice that China lost a significant number of civilians, mostly because of the Japanese invasion. Japan lost a decent number of its military and civilians. You'll notice that the civilian deaths for the United States are almost negligible, totally. The war not fought in the United States. The war doesn't ravish the American countryside like it does to Europe. But on top of the 20 million military personnel, it's really those 40 million, twice as many civilians who are killed. That's just staggering. And this is something you don't see, at least not in that many numbers, for the First World War. So think about how this affected the global international psyche. Not only were political orientations reorganized, right? At the end of the Second World War, it's the United States who asserts itself as a global power, largely because of the use of the atomic bomb. So the political things have changed, but social mentalities have changed too. How has this massive death and destruction been allowed in the 20th century? The product of all of this industrialization. How have we allowed industrialization to not bring good, to not bring medicine and life-saving powers, but how has it brought so much death? And that's, kind of really what you've got to think about here, right? That's point number 2. The extent of the Holocaust was just made so public, and people's social orientations are just totally rocked by that reality. And then number 3, the use of atomic weapons signaled to everyone around the world that things had changed, right? In 1918, these reparations that were created, people kind of knew fair well that they were to punish Germany, and perhaps down the road this could lead to more war. But think about in 1945. People saw the use of atomic weapons, and think about what their thought for the next World War was going to be. If any of you are big music fans, perhaps you're aware of the song by Bob Dylan, right? That talks about World War III. Or Einstein, perhaps you know his famous quote. I don't know what World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones, signifying the idea that weapons had become so destructive that another global war might mean the destruction of civilization as we know it. And like I said, this is a war and the outcomes of a war that are broadcast to people across the world. And it's something you've really got to consider about how radically this changed people's mindsets. I've got here images from newspapers, talking about the Holocaust in the upper left and the atomic bomb in the bottom right, and images that appeared in newspapers that people around the world took in and started to consider, we can't let this happen again. But at the same time, it appeared like another world war was just around the corner, which is really kind of not that surprising, considering between 1918 and 1938, there's only 20 years. So people in 1945 could have conceivingly believed that by 1965, there'll be another global war. And they worried that this global war might be the last one, especially because two powers were incredibly antagonistic towards each other. There was the United States in one corner, backed by its Western allies, Great Britain and France in particular. And then there was the Soviet Union, Russia in another corner, who was exerting its influence in Asia, right? The Chinese are going to have a socialist, a communist revolution. There's going to be a communist revolution in Korea, a communist revolution in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. And Americans, British, and French worried that these communist revolutions were going to sweep across the world, right? The domino effect. Sure, China was a third world country in 1950, so the revolution going on there didn't really matter. And so was Vietnam. Most Americans in the 1960s and 70s couldn't point out Vietnam on a map. But Americans and the British and the French, they worried that if one nation falls, then what's stopping another nation, like India, then Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and then what if it's Europe, right? What if France falls to communism? What if Great Britain? What if the United States falls to communism? This Cold War, right? Cold because it never gets hot. The Soviet Union and the United States never go to war directly, thank goodness, because of the use of atomic weapons. But this Cold War was about a balance of power. And there are some really important major events during the Cold War, and I get beyond 1950 here, but it's important to take these in control. The Korean War, right? Fought between the Communist North and the Free South, backed by the UN and the US. It's important. The Chinese Revolution, a communist-supported USSR-backed revolution in China that eventually has China fall to communism. The Berlin Wall that's erected in Berlin, conquered Berlin, the capital of Germany, which is again punished without allowing to have its own government, is now divided. Communist in the east, free in the west, like all of Europe, an iron curtain drawn down the middle of Europe. The Cuban Missile Crisis that frightens Americans in the 1960s, and a nuclear war is not going to happen in Asia or happen in Europe. Maybe it happens in the United States when the Soviet Union tries to move nuclear weapons to Cuba, just like the Americans had nuclear weapons in Turkey on the borders of the Soviet Union. And finally, there was the proxy war in Vietnam, which is northern Soviet-backed communists invade the South, and the U.S. is going to lose that one, withdraw in 1975. So the point I want to bring out here is this is a map of the post-war, notice that, New World, right? Totally different from 1914. If you were to look at a map in 1914, all the attention would be on Europe and its colonizing of Africa and Southeast Asia. But here we have the New World of 1945. The world that's oriented around the West, meaning the United States and its allies, and the East, or the communists, which would be the Soviet Union and its allies. So think about how this political reordering looked, but also think about the social reordering, right? You see on this map the different nations, right, and the different sides of this conflict, but also consider how people thought about the world differently. In 1914, the coming of war was kind of celebrated, but no one hoped the world went to war again in a World War III. Why was that? Politics, but also social psyche. I look forward to your answers, And if you have any questions, email me.